15 months, thousands of volunteers, tons of stone and timber. A French priest had raised on the crest of a hill in Brittany a monumental Calvary, a work that proclaimed the passion of Christ across the landscape like a cry, visible from kilometers in every direction. On the eve of the blessing, when everything was ready, when the crowds were already preparing for the inauguration, the order arrived: destroy it. The soldiers razed in days what had taken months to build, stone by stone, cross by cross, station by station, until nothing remained on the hill but the wind and the silence. When Louis-Marie Grignion de Montfort surveyed the ruins of his Calvary, he did not curse the king nor weep before the rubble. He said a single sentence: "We raise the cross here on the earth, we shall raise it now in our hearts." And he kept walking, always walking, because this man's life was, from beginning to end, a pilgrimage toward Rome, toward the poor, toward Mary, toward the cross. And nothing and no one could stop him. France, the end of the 17th century, the most powerful kingdom in Europe, lives under the radiance of the Sun King. Louis XIV governs from Versailles with a magnificence that dazzles the world. Marble palaces, gardens stretching to the horizon, a court where every gesture is ritual and every word is politics. Absolutism has reached its apex. The king does not merely govern the nation, he governs the church. Gallicanism, the doctrine that subordinates ecclesiastical authority to royal power, has turned the French bishops into functionaries of the throne rather than shepherds of souls. But there is a sickness deeper than politics eating away at the faith of France. It is called Jansenism. It began as a movement of theological rigor, but it has become something far darker, a version of Catholicism that freezes the heart instead of inflaming it. The Jansenists preach a God who is severe, distant, almost cruel, a merciless judge before whose holiness the human being can only feel terror. Communion is rare because no one is worthy. Confession is a tribunal. Joy is suspect. Popular devotion, processions, rosaries, images, hymns, is despised as the superstition of the ignorant. And at the center of that contempt stands Mary. The Jansenists consider Marian devotion a dangerous distraction, a veiled idolatry that interposes a creature between the soul and God. Where the people see the mother, they see an obstacle. Where the peasants pray the rosary with simple faith, the theologians of Port Royal frown with educated disdain. It is against this wall, the wall of rigorism, of spiritual elitism, of a theology that has forgotten that God has the heart of a father and the face of a mother, that a Breton priest is about to crash with the full force of his soul. Louis-Marie Grignion was born on January 31st, 1673, in Montfort-sur-Mer, a small town in Brittany. He was the second of 18 children, yes, 18, of Jean-Baptiste Grignion, a lawyer of violent temperament, and Jeanne Robert de la Viezeule, a devout woman who found in prayer the refuge her husband did not give her. Louis-Marie's childhood was marked by a contrast that would shape his entire character: the father's harshness and the mother's tenderness. From one he learned strength, that granite stubbornness that no persecution could bend. From the other, he learned devotion, that relationship with Mary that would become the axis of his entire life. From childhood, Louis-Marie was different. Not different in the way hagiographers say when they want to embellish an infancy, truly different. He organized small processions with the other children of the village. He built makeshift altars in the corners of the house. He prayed the rosary with a concentration that bewildered the adults. His godmother recounted that she once found him kneeling before an image of the Virgin, motionless, his eyes closed, for so long that she thought he had fallen asleep. He was not sleeping. He was praying with an intensity his child's body could barely contain. At 12, he entered the Jesuit college in Rennes, where he distinguished himself as a brilliant but uncomfortable student. Brilliant because his intelligence was evident. Uncomfortable because his piety was excessive for the taste of an institution that valued balance and moderation. Louis-Marie did not know moderation. In anything, not in prayer, not in penance, not in zeal, not in charity. Everything he did to the maximum, as though lukewarmness were the one sin his temperament could not tolerate. When he decided to become a priest, the family did not celebrate. His father would have preferred a lawyer, but Louis-Marie was not a man of negotiations. He made his decision, packed the little he owned, and set out for Paris, on foot of course, to enter the seminary of Saint-Sulpice. From the very first step, the pattern was set. Montfort walks when the world expects him to take a carriage. Saint-Sulpice was the most prestigious seminary in France, the factory of priests that fed the dioceses of the kingdom with clergymen who were well-formed, well-connected, well-adapted to the system. Louis-Marie entered as a poor student. He had no money, no patron, no influential family to open doors. He survived on the charity that other seminarians gave him with the condescension of those born on the right side of the table. But what he lacked in resources he made up for in inner fire. While the other seminarians studied theology with the coolness of someone preparing for an exam, Louis-Marie lived it with the veracity of someone who has found water in the desert. And at the center of all his spirituality, like a sun illuminating everything, stood Mary. The superiors at Saint-Sulpice regarded his Marian devotion with discomfort. It was too much, too many rosaries, too many hours before the image of the Virgin, too much emotion in an atmosphere that valued restraint. Jansenism permeated the air of the seminary like a subtle but persistent perfume. No one declared himself a Jansenist openly, but the distrust of popular piety and Marian devotion was in the water they drank. Louis-Marie did not adapt. He did not soften his devotion. He did not lower the volume. He went on praying the rosary with the same intensity as the first day. He went on speaking of Mary with a passion that some mistook for fanaticism and others recognized, perhaps in spite of themselves, as the flame of something authentic. He was ordained a priest on June 5th, 1700. He was 27 years old. The Church of France had just received, without knowing it, the man who would make it most uncomfortable in the coming century. What followed was a pattern that would repeat with the regularity of a metronome throughout the 16 years he had left to live. Arrival, transformation, persecution, expulsion. His first assignment was the hospital of Poitiers, a place of indescribable misery where the sick were crammed together amid dirty sheets and corrupt officials. Montfort did not merely celebrate Mass for the inmates, he reorganized the entire hospital. He cleaned, he ordered. He personally cared for the most repulsive patients, the ones no one wanted to touch, the ones who reeked, the ones who lay dying forgotten in dark corners. He washed their wounds with the same hands that elevated the Eucharist. He treated them as what they were, Christ sick, Christ suffering, Christ hidden beneath the skin of the discarded. The witnesses of those months in Poitiers described scenes that would have horrified any drawing-room cleric. Montfort emptying the bedpans of the gravest patients with his own hands. Montfort carrying in his arms an old man covered with sores to a clean bed he himself had prepared. Montfort sitting beside the dying for hours, holding their hand, praying with them, accompanying them to their last breath. When a contagious patient was abandoned by everyone, doctors, nurses, even the other patients who recoiled in terror, Montfort embraced him. He embraced him the way one embraces a brother, as though in that putrefying body he saw what no one else could see, the face of Christ crucified. But his zeal did not stop at the sick. He discovered that the hospital administration was diverting funds, serving rotten food, keeping the inmates in conditions a stable would have rejected. Montfort denounced the abuses. He demanded reforms. He confronted the officials with the same firmness with which he preached from the pulpit. He was not diplomatic. He was not prudent. He was just, and justice, when exercised without filters, is the most uncomfortable force in the world. The hospital administration, accustomed to a system of profitable neglect, felt threatened. This priest was disrupting the established order. He was expelled. He sought permission to preach in the diocese. He preached with fire. His sermons were not theological lectures, but volcanic eruptions that shook the consciences of his listeners with a force that well-bred clergymen considered vulgar. Montfort shouted, wept, fell to his knees, brandished the crucifix before the crowd like a sword. He organized processions through the streets with hundreds of faithful singing hymns to Mary. He planted crosses in the squares. He lit bonfires where people threw obscene books, playing cards, and superstitious charms. The villages were transformed, confessions multiplied, taverns closed, broken marriages were reconciled, and the bishops were terrified. Not because they doubted the fruits were undeniable, but because Montfort was uncontrollable. He did not ask permission. He did not follow protocols. He did not soften his message to please the powerful. He preached the same truth in the palace and in the stable, and truth, when preached without filters, always makes someone uncomfortable. The Bishop of Poitiers forbade him to preach in his diocese. Montfort obeyed. He went to another diocese. They banned him there too. He went to another and another. Door after door closed before him, like the inns of Bethlehem before the Holy Family. And like Joseph, Montfort did not stop. He kept walking. In 1706, with no diocese willing to receive him, Montfort made the boldest decision of his life. If the bishops of France did not want him, he would go to the only authority above them all, the Pope. He walked from Poitiers to Rome, more than 1,500 kilometers, barefoot for much of the journey, without money, without provisions, begging bread in the villages along the way, sleeping in the open, in stables, in church porticos, sometimes in the rain, sometimes under a sun that baked the roads of southern France and northern Italy. Every step was an act of faith. Every day's march, a prayer walked. The road took him through the Alps, mountains that in winter devoured imprudent travelers. Montfort crossed them the way he crossed everything, praying the rosary, trusting in providence, putting one foot in front of the other with no plan beyond arriving. In the villages of northern Italy, the peasants watched him with a mixture of curiosity and pity. That ragged French priest, with his feet in shreds and his eyes ablaze, looked like a madman or a saint. He was probably both. He arrived in Rome covered in dust and sores, his feet bloodied, his cassock in tatters. But his eyes burned with the same flame he had seen burning in the pupils of the prophets he read in Scripture. Pope Clement V received him, not immediately. Montfort had to wait, the way the poor wait, until the Vatican bureaucracy cracked open a sliver. But when he finally knelt before the pontiff and told his story, the missions, the conversions, the closed doors, the bishops who rejected him, the fire he felt in his chest that no one would let him share, something changed in the Pope's face. Clement V was a prudent man, trained in Vatican diplomacy, not given to enthusiasms. But he recognized authenticity when it stood before him. And what stood before him was not a fanatic. It was an apostle. "You have a great field of apostolate in France," the Pope told him. "Go back and preach, but always in perfect submission to the bishops." It was an answer that contained both the authorization and the break. The Pope opened the door, but asked Montfort not to knock it down, and he conferred on him the title of apostolic missionary, a direct authorization from the successor of Peter to preach anywhere in France. Montfort left the audience with tears in his eyes. Not tears of triumphant joy, tears of relief. Someone, at last, had told him he was not mad, that his fire came from God and not from fever, that the church needed him even if the church did not know it. He returned to France with the authority of the successor of Peter in his pocket. The bishops who had closed their doors now had to tolerate him, though the tolerance in many cases resembled an armed truce more than a welcome. The years that followed were the most fruitful and the most exhausting of his life. Montfort hurled himself into the popular missions with an energy that defied all bodily logic. He crisscrossed Brittany and the Vendée on foot, from village to village, from parish to parish, carrying a massive cross on his shoulders like a perpetual penitent. His method was always the same, and it always worked. He would arrive at a parish. He would preach for weeks, sometimes a full month. The sermons were spectacles of faith that combined theology, drama, and raw emotion. Montfort did not speak of God as a concept. He spoke of God as someone who was there, in the square, among the crowd, waiting for them to open their hearts. He reenacted the Passion with an intensity that made the toughest men weep. He knelt in the mud. He raised the crucifix to the sky. He cried the name of Mary with a voice that reached the last rows. And then came the public rosaries, immense processions winding along the dirt roads with hundreds, sometimes thousands of peasants singing the Hail Mary under rain or sun. Montfort placed the rosary at the center of everything, not as a repetitive formula, but as a spiritual weapon, as the breathing of the soul, as the heartbeat of a faith that needed rhythm to stay alive. Then came the confessions, endless lines of men and women who had not confessed in years, in decades, sins that weighed like stones and that finally found an ear willing to listen without condemning. Montfort heard confessions for hours, until dawn, until the last penitent had been absolved. And finally, the act that sealed every mission, the renewal of baptismal promises and the consecration to Mary. Entire communities on their knees, promising to renounce Satan and consecrate themselves to Jesus Christ through the hands of Mary. It was the heart of Montfort's spirituality, made collective flesh, not a private devotion, but a communal transformation. The fruits were visible. Villages that before the mission had been nests of blasphemy, drunkenness, and domestic violence became communities where the rosary was prayed at dusk, where spouses treated each other with respect, where the poor were cared for. Not all the fruits lasted. Montfort was a realist, but those that lasted changed lives forever. In 1709, Montfort conceived his most ambitious project. On the outskirts of Pontchâteau in Brittany, there was a hill that commanded the landscape like a natural pulpit. Montfort saw it and knew. There he would raise a monumental Calvary. Not a small cross on the roadside, a complete Calvary, the 14 stations, the crosses of Golgotha, the figures of Christ, of Mary, of John, of the thieves, carved in stone and wood, visible from kilometers around. A cry of faith planted in the soil of Brittany that no one could ignore. The response from the people was staggering. Thousands of volunteers came, peasants who left their plows to haul stones, craftsmen who donated their labor, women who brought food for the workers, children who carried sand in little buckets, the elderly who prayed the rosary at the foot of the hill while the young built. For 15 months, that hill became a swarming hive of active faith, the greatest manifestation of popular piety Brittany had seen in generations. Montfort directed the work with the energy of 10 men. He designed, he carved, he hauled stones, he encouraged the volunteers. He preached in the evenings after the day's work. He slept no more than 4 hours. He ate nothing but bread and water. And every morning, before the first worker arrived, he climbed to the summit of the hill to pray the rosary, gazing at the horizon, as though he could see, from there, every soul in France that needed the cross. Everything was ready. The blessing was scheduled. The crowds were converging on Pontchâteau from every corner of Brittany. Then the order came. The Jansenists, who had failed to stop Montfort with ecclesiastical prohibitions, changed strategy. They turned to the civil power. They convinced King Louis XIV that the Calvary was, in reality, a disguised fortress, a gathering point for conspirators, a threat to the security of the state. It was absurd. Anyone who saw the structure knew it was a religious monument, not a military fortification. But the king, paranoid by nature and surrounded by Jansenist advisors, signed the order of demolition. The soldiers arrived at Pontchâteau and razed in a few days what had taken 15 months to build. Stone by stone, cross by cross, station by station, the volunteers who had poured their sweat and their faith into every block watched helplessly as the work of their hands became rubble. Montfort surveyed the ruins, and instead of rage, the witnesses saw on his face something they could not name, a blend of sorrow and peace, possessed only by those who have understood that God's plans are not measured by the yardstick of men. He spoke the sentence that tradition preserves as his most concentrated spiritual testament: "We raised the cross here on the earth, we shall raise it now in our hearts." And he kept walking, toward the next mission, toward the next cross, toward the next battle. It was in the midst of those missions, between one village and the next, between one persecution and the next, that Montfort wrote the work that would immortalize him, though he would not live to see it. The True Devotion to the Blessed Virgin Mary is not a long book. It runs to some 200 pages that can be read in an afternoon. But every page is a depth charge of concentrated insight that Marian theology had not known before, nor, many would say, has known since. The central thesis is simple and revolutionary at once. Mary is not an obstacle between the soul and Christ. She is the shortest, safest, most perfect path to him. God chose to come into the world through Mary. Therefore, the path back to God also passes through her. To consecrate oneself to Jesus through Mary is not to subtract from Christ. It is to imitate him, because Christ himself chose to depend on her, to make himself small in her womb, to learn from her lips, to grow under her gaze. Montfort formulated what he called holy slavery of love, the total surrender to Jesus through the hands of Mary. Everything we are, everything we have, everything we do, placed in the mother's hands so that she may offer it to the Son, not as obligation, but as the freest act a soul can perform. Because the highest freedom is not doing what we want, but giving ourselves to the one who loves us most. The most extraordinary thing about the treatise is what Montfort wrote about its own destiny. He predicted, with a clairvoyance that raises the hair on one's arms, that the manuscript would be fought and hidden, that many years would pass before it saw the light, but that when it was finally published, it would unleash a Marian revolution that would shake the entire church. And he hid the manuscript. 126 years later, in 1842, a Montfortian priest found the text at the bottom of a trunk, in a country house, covered in dust, gnawed by rats, with torn pages that had to be reconstructed. They published it, and the effect was exactly what Montfort had prophesied. The book burned like fire through dry grass across the church. Seminaries studied it, convents meditated on it, the faithful devoured it. Consecrations to Mary, according to Montfort's method, multiplied by the millions, and a young Polish worker named Karol Wojtyła, laboring in a factory in Krakow during the Nazi occupation, read it in secret and felt that those yellowed pages revealed to him the meaning of his life. When that worker became Pope John Paul II, he chose as the motto of his pontificate 2 words drawn directly from the treatise, Totus Tuus, all yours, Mary. And with those 2 words, Montfort, dead for nearly 3 centuries, forgotten for generations, fought by the powerful, conquered from the grave, the heart of the universal church. But the treatise was not Montfort's only written legacy. There is another text, less known but equally powerful, that reveals the other half of his soul, the Letter to the Friends of the Cross. If the treatise is his Marian work, the letter is his cruciform work. And the two are inseparable, as Mary and the cross are inseparable at the foot of Calvary. Montfort did not conceive of devotion to Mary without the cross, nor the cross without Mary. They were the 2 arms of the same embrace of God. In the letter, Montfort writes to the members of a confraternity he himself had founded, groups of lay people who pledged to carry their daily cross with faith and joy. And what he tells them is not the comfortable spirituality the modern world would like to hear. It is the opposite. If you wish to be friends of the cross, he writes, you must embrace suffering, not as punishment, but as privilege, not as a curse, but as a blessing in disguise. The cross is not an accident on the Christian's path. It is the path. This spirituality was not theory for Montfort. It was his biography. Every expulsion was a cross, every closed door, a nail, every destroyed Calvary, a lance in his side. And Montfort did not flee from these crosses, nor endure them with stoic resignation. He embraced them, he sought them, he loved them, not with a morbid love of pain, but with the conviction that every suffering accepted in love becomes redemption for others. Mary and the cross, total consecration and redemptive suffering. These are the two pillars on which Montfort built his entire spirituality and his entire life. One cannot be understood without the other, and Montfort cannot be understood without both. Montfort's body, punished by decades of barefoot pilgrimages, extreme penances, sleepless nights, and open-air preaching in the rain and cold of Brittany, began to surrender far sooner than it should have. At 43, he looked like an old man, his legs swollen, his voice eroded, his chest whistling with every breath. But he did not stop. He never stopped. His final mission was in Saint-Laurent-sur-Sèvre, a small town in the Vendée. He preached with the same intensity as ever, or perhaps with more, as though he knew that every word might be his last. The witnesses noticed that during those final sermons, Montfort spoke of death with a familiarity that was not morbid but luminous, like someone speaking of a journey he has long been preparing for. On April 28, 1716, Louis-Marie Grignion de Montfort died in Saint-Laurent-sur-Sèvre. He was 43 years old. He died as he had lived, clutching a crucifix in one hand and an image of the Virgin in the other. The two devotions of his life united in death, the cross and Mary, Mary and the cross, inseparable in his heart as they had been on Calvary. They buried him in the village church, and there he remains today, in the same town where he died, which has become a center of pilgrimage and the mother house of the congregations he founded. The seeds Montfort planted were slow to sprout, but when they sprouted, they bore a fruit he himself would have considered disproportionate. The congregations he founded were not born in the comfort of an ecclesiastical office. They were born in the open air, in persecution, in the most extreme poverty, like everything Montfort did. The story of the Daughters of Wisdom begins with a young woman named Marie-Louise Trichet. Montfort met her in Poitiers when she was 17. He saw in her a vocation that burned with the same intensity as his own. He gave her a grey habit, a crucifix, and a mission, to serve the poor and the sick. But he could not formally found the congregation. He had no resources, no authorization, nothing except the certainty that God would provide. Marie-Louise waited. She waited 10 years. 10 years during which Montfort wandered from mission to mission, from expulsion to expulsion, unable to give her more than spiritual instructions by letter and the promise that someday the congregation would exist. 10 years during which she lived alone with her habit and her cross, without community, without rule, without companions, with nothing but the faith that the word of a priest rejected by everyone was, somehow, the word of God. In 1703, finally, a second young woman joined Marie-Louise. There were two of them, two women in grey habits in a world that did not understand them, but from those two would grow a congregation that today numbers thousands of religious in dozens of countries, dedicated to exactly what Montfort dreamed, serving the poorest with the wisdom of the gospel. The Company of Mary, the Montfortian priests, had an equally precarious beginning. Montfort did not live to see it consolidated. He left only a handful of disciples, bound together by the founder's charism and by the conviction that Marian devotion was not a pious ornament, but the engine of all evangelization. Those few men survived Montfort's death. They survived the French Revolution that destroyed nearly all religious life in the country. The Montfortians were dispersed, their houses confiscated, some imprisoned, but they survived. And when the storm passed, they returned. Like the Calvary of Pontchâteau, destroyed and rebuilt, Montfort's work refused to die. Today, the Montfortians work in more than 30 countries, faithful to their founder's charism, to preach Christ through Mary, with a preference for the poor and the abandoned. Pope Leo III beatified him in 1888. Pius V canonized him in 1947. But it was John Paul II who brought him to the center of the world's Catholic consciousness. In his first encyclical as Pope, he cited Montfort. In his travels across the world, he recommended the Treatise. In his spiritual testament, he wrote once more, Totus Tuus. The connection between the Breton priest of the 18th century and the Polish Pope of the 20th is one of the most beautiful threads of providence. As though Montfort, by hiding the manuscript, had sent it through time directly into the hands of the man who would need it most and carry it farthest. The consecration to Jesus through Mary, according to Montfort's method, is practiced today by millions of Catholics around the world. 33 days of preparation, prayer, meditation, renunciation, and at the end, the act of total surrender. All that I am and all that I have in your hands, Mary, so that you may offer it to Jesus. Not as an empty rite, but as a decision that reorganizes an entire life, like placing a magnet next to iron filings and watching everything align in a single direction. The Legion of Mary, the Schoenstatt movement, the rosary communities in parishes around the world all drink, directly or indirectly, from the spring that Montfort opened with his life and his pen. The Marian Revolution he prophesied has not ended. It continues to expand. It continues to transform hearts. It continues to prove that Mary is not a detour on the road to Christ. She is the shortcut. If you could climb the hill of Pontchâteau today, you would find a Calvary, not the original, that was destroyed by order of the king. But in 1821, more than a century later, the Bretons rebuilt what the soldiers had demolished, stone by stone, cross by cross, station by station. As though faith had a longer memory than power, and the crosses that are torn down always end up rising again. Montfort teaches us a truth that the modern world urgently needs to hear, that Mary does not compete with Christ, but leads to him. That devotion to the mother is not the sentimentality of old women, but the most radical path of total surrender to God. That destroyed crosses are rebuilt, not always on the same hill, but always in some heart willing to receive them. That buried books resurface, that rejected priests end up being canonized. That barefoot pilgrims travel farther than those who ride in carriages, and that the most powerful phrase in human language has only two words, Totus Tuus. All yours, Mary, all yours, Christ. All, without reservation, without conditions, without looking back. Saint Louis-Marie Grignion de Montfort, priest, missionary, slave of Mary, tireless pilgrim of the cross, pray for us. Pray for those who preach and are rejected. Pray for those who build and see their work destroyed. Pray for those who walk alone in the direction no one else wants to take. And teach us that true devotion to Mary is not one devotion among many. It is the door through which everything else enters.